We enjoy history here, don't we? Because it gives us some perspective that we wouldn't otherwise have. Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was our 17th president. He was Abraham Lincoln's vice president, as you know. He was a Democrat. He was vice president during Lincoln's second term, and he became president upon Lincoln's assassination, April in 1865. Now, you can get his biography. You can go to the History Place, the History Channel, wherever you want. He was born to a poor family in North Carolina. Never attended school. He was self-educated. But he had a flair for public speaking, and he got into politics. I guess we could call him today a bit of a populist. Went from mayor, congressman, governor, senator. He'd been a slaveholder, but he was loyal to the Union. And when Tennessee seceded from the nation during the Civil War, he still supported and was loyal to the Union. That's how he came to Lincoln's attention. So Lincoln early on appoints him to be military governor of Tennessee. And he chooses Johnson, a Democrat, as his running mate in 1864. And, of course, they won. They swept the victory. Andrew Johnson was impeached after Lincoln was assassinated. A series, as the History Place points out, a series of bitter political quarrels between Johnson and the so-called radical Republicans in Congress over Reconstruction in the South would lead to his impeachment. The radical Republicans, that was their name, wanted to enact sweeping transformation of Southern social and economic life, permanently ending the old planter class system. And they wanted to grant slaves full-fledged citizenship, including voting rights. Now, the radicals included a number of notable figures. Now, after the war, they came to believe whites in the South were seeking to somehow preserve the old slave system under a new guise. They observed an unrepentant South featuring new state governments full of ex-Confederates passing repressive labor laws and punitive black codes targeting freed slaves. And by the way, that did happen in many Southern states. For example, black codes in Mississippi prohibited free men from testifying against whites, allowed unemployed blacks to be arrested for vagrancy, and hired out as cheap labor, mandated separate public schools. Blacks were also prohibited from serving on juries, bearing arms, or holding large gatherings. And by the way, this is why the assassination, in my view, of Lincoln was so horrific. The fact of the assassination was horrific, but I feel Reconstruction would have gone in a very much more positive direction. Anyway, so when the U.S. Congress convened on December 4th, 1865, representatives sent from the South included the former Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens of Georgia, along with 4 ex-Confederate generals, 8 colonels, 6 cabinet members, and numerous lesser-known rebels. Northern congressmen, furious upon realizing this, omitted the Southerners from the roll call and then denied them seats in Congress to all representatives from the 11 former Confederate states. Radical Republican views gathered momentum in Congress and were in the majority by the end of 1865. In April of 1866, Congress enacted a Civil Rights Act in response to Southern black codes. The act granted new rights to native-born blacks, including the right to testify in court, to sue, and to buy property. These were the Republicans. President Johnson vetoed the act, claiming it was an invasion of states' rights and would cause discord among the races. Congress overrode the veto by a single vote. Now, this marked the beginning of an escalating power struggle between the President and Congress that would eventually lead to Johnson's impeachment. Bitter personal attacks also occurred with Johnson, labeled as a drunken imbecile and a ludicrous bore, and by the way, was a heavy drinker. While the President called radicals domineering, tyrannical men, fastidious. Unfortunately for Johnson, he had appeared drunk in public during his vice presidential inauguration. In fact, Lincoln once commented on that. Weakened by a fever at the time, he'd taken brandy to fortify himself, but wound up incoherent and lambasted several high-ranking dignitaries who were present. In June of 1866, Congress passed the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, guaranteeing civil liberties for both native-born and naturalized Americans, and prohibiting any state from depriving citizens of life, liberty, or property without due process. The amendment granted the right to vote to all males 21 and older. Johnson opposed the amendment on the grounds it did not apply to Southerners who were without any representation in Congress. Tennessee was the only Southern state to ratify the amendment. The others, encouraged in part by Johnson, refused. Amid increasing newspaper reports of violence against blacks in the South, moderate voters in the North began leaning toward the radicals. Johnson made matters worse by attempting to join all moderates in a new political party, the National Union Party, to counter the radicals. To drum up support, he went on a nationwide speaking tour, but his gruff, uncouth behavior toward his political opponents alienated those who heard him and left many with the impression that Johnson's true supporters were mainly ex-rebels. As a result, the radicals swept the election of November 1866, resulting in a two-thirds anti-Johnson majority in both the House and the Senate. With this majority, 3 consecutive vetoes by Johnson were overridden by Congress in 1867, thus passing the Military Reconstruction Act, Command of the Army Act, and Tenure of Office Act against his wishes. The Military Reconstruction Act divided the South into 5 military districts under federal control and imposed strict requirements on Southern states in order for them to be readmitted to the Union, including ratification of the 14th Amendment and new state constitutions in conformity with the U.S. Constitution. The other 2 acts limited Johnson's power as president to interfere with congressional reconstruction. The Command of the Army Act required Johnson to issue all military orders through the General of the Army, at the time General Ulysses S. Grant, instead of dealing directly with military governors in the South. Now, that clearly was unconstitutional. The Tenure of Office Act required the consent of the Senate for the president to remove an officeholder whose appointment had been originally confirmed by the Senate. Now, that clearly is unconstitutional. Now you know where I'm going with this. The Tenure of Office Act required the consent of the Senate for the president to remove an officeholder whose appointment had been originally confirmed by the Senate. Many in Congress wanted to keep radical sympathizer Secretary of War Edwin Stanton in Johnson's cabinet. The political feud between the president and Congress climaxed as Johnson sought to oust Stanton in violation of the Tenure of Office Act. And during a cabinet meeting in early August, Stanton had informed the president that the 5 military governors in the South were now answerable to Congress and not to him as president, and that the new military chain of command passed from the commander of the Army through the House of Representatives. Again, clearly unconstitutional. On August 12, 1867, an outraged President Johnson suspended Stanton and named General Ulysses S. Grant to replace him. However, the Senate refused to confirm Johnson's action. Grant then voluntarily relinquished the office back to Stanton. On February 21, 1868, challenging the constitutionality of the Tenure of Office Act, Johnson continued his defiance of Congress and named General Lorenzo Thomas as the new Secretary of War, and also ordered the military governors to report directly to him. This time Stanton refused to budge and even barricaded himself in his office. 3 days later, the House of Representatives voted impeachment on party line vote of 126 to 47. On the vague grounds of high crimes and misdemeanors, with the specific charges to be drafted by a special committee. And that special committee drafted 11 articles of impeachment, which approved a week later. Articles 1 through 8 charged Johnson with illegally removing Stanton from office. Article 9 accused Johnson of violating the Command of the Army Act. The last 2 charged Johnson with libeling Congress through inflammatory and scandalous harangues, quote unquote. The trial in the Senate began on March 5, 1868, with Supreme Court Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase presiding. Prosecution was conducted by 7 managers from the House, including Thaddeus Stevens and Benjamin Butler. Johnson did not appear in person. On March 16, a crucial vote occurred on Article 11 concerning Johnson's overall behavior towards Congress. A straw poll indicated the Senate was 1 vote shy of the necessary 2/3, 36 votes out of 54 senators needed for conviction. Johnson's fate rested upon the single undecided vote of a young radical Republican named Edmund Ross of Kansas. Despite monumental pressure from fellow radicals and dire warnings that a vote for acquittal would end his political career, Ross stood up at the appropriate moment and quietly announced, "Not guilty," effectively ending the impeachment trial. On May 26, 2 more ballots produced the same 35-19 result. Thus, Johnson's impeachment was not upheld by a single vote, and he remained in office. After completing his term, Johnson returned to Tennessee and so forth. What's the moral of this story? I'll explain it when we return. I'll be right back. Edmund Ross is considered by some a hero, by others not so much. He was ousted from the Republican Party, and he became a Democrat. And pretty much he was finished. So I have to ask this question when it comes to our current president. Andy McCarthy wrote a piece about this, and of course we've been asking this question too. What exactly is it that Donald Trump did or has done that warrants impeachment? What is the precise crime that he's committed? Well, there is none. He's committed none. He's obstructed nothing. Does Mr. Mueller look like or act like he's been obstructed? Has anybody limited his staff, limited his expenses, limited his areas of inquiry? Well, certainly not the president. Has anybody stopped Mr. Wray, the new FBI director, from conducting his investigation? No. Isn't it true that Mr. McCabe, before he was fired and is now under criminal investigation, the former deputy FBI director, isn't it true that he testified before Congress that he had all the resources necessary? Yes. There's been no obstruction of any kind. There's been no crime of any kind. Well, he's given this reason and that reason, so what? He can give whatever reason he wants. The president had the power to fire Comey. He has the power to fire anybody under his control. He's the president of the United States. That's why we elect him. He has a constitutional power. And so, should they try to impeach the president of the United States, we have to take the brass knuckles off, ladies and gentlemen. I say this figuratively. And if they want to have a UFC match, then we have to have a UFC match. That's the way it is.